Hey y'all, it's Jennifer. Welcome back to my channel. Today I am coming to you with another Victober video. And so over the past couple of weeks, I have been asking here on my community tab, but also over on Instagram, for your favorite and also your least favorite Victorian novels. And so I've already gone over the worst Victorian novels, and today I thought we could go over the best. And as I expected, there is a lot of overlap between y'all's best and worst Victorian novels. There are so many Victorian novels that I think are either love it or hate it. So I wasn't really shocked to see some of the ones that were on your worst novels pop up again as the best. But something that did kind of shock me is that really there were only a handful that were mentioned in terms of the best Victorian novels that y'all have ever read. It felt like the worst. There were a lot of different titles out there. In fact, I didn't even get to cover all of the books that people told me were their worst. But there were some clear front runners in terms of your all-time favorites. So let's go on and get into this. I think there was a clear winner here, and the one that I got the most was Jane Eyre. And if you remember, Jane Eyre was actually one of the ones that wound up on some people's worst Victorian novel. Jane Eyre is a really interesting one because I hated it the first time that I read it, and then I really loved it the second time around. So I definitely can see both sides of the argument here, that it's someone's favorite of all time, but also that it could be someone's worst. Something that was also really interesting when compiling the best Victorian novels, y'all's favorites, is that people often just gave me the title of the book and they did not really give me an explanation for it. Whereas the worst books, people were constantly telling me what it was about that one that made them hate it. And Jane Eyre is one that I was often just given a title for. No one explained what it was they loved about this. Jane Eyre, though, is one of my favorite Victorian novels, and really the reason I would say it's one of my favorites is that I think the romance is so incredibly well done. For me, this is one of the most romantic Victorian novels, and just in general, it's just one of the most romantic novels that I've ever read. And I know you're thinking, Jenny, are you okay? No, I'm not, because that is actually what I'm into. But I also really appreciate a gothic vibe, a ghostly vibe, and all of that is really present in Jane Eyre. So I can see why this one rose to the top. I got this 15 times. This is definitely the clear winner. I also got more than a few times The Picture of Dorian Gray, which, similar to Jane Eyre, is one that popped up more than a few times with people telling me it was their worst book they've ever read. And Dorian Gray is so interesting because I feel like you have to be a certain type of reader to really appreciate it, to really get into it. Because to me, Dorian Gray, if it were published today, I genuinely think people would say is kind of all vibes, no plot. I think Dorian Gray is really 100% about the aesthetic. And so that's why I can definitely see why this one works for some people but doesn't work for others. I am someone who just loves that. I love aesthetic. I love beautiful writing. I love beautiful prose. And that's really why Dorian Gray is not just one of my favorite Victorian novels, but one of my favorite classics. I also think Dorian Gray is very approachable. And I often tell people who are not all that familiar with classics, who don't read them that often, I kind of think Dorian Gray is modern in a way. It's very updated in terms of its concepts and the conversations that it wants to have. But I also think it is really beautifully written and it's still very approachable. I don't think this is one that leaves you confused. Sometimes when you go back to Victorian novels and you're trying to get back into that headspace, I think you struggle with the prose. But I don't necessarily find that in terms of The Picture of Dorian Gray. I just think it's really, really beautifully written. And I know some of the people who said Dorian Gray, and it definitely seems like it's 100% their vibe to love this one. So I wasn't shocked to see this one as much as I did. I also had more than a few people mention Sherlock Holmes. And if you've been around on my channel for the past few Victobers, you probably know I don't like Sherlock Holmes at all. And I've always wondered why that is. I have just never gotten on with Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's writing. And in fact, I don't like Sherlock Holmes in adaptations. I just don't like Sherlock Holmes as a character. And I think it's really hard to go back and read a book where you know what's going to happen, where you know the outcome, especially when it is a mystery novel. And I think so many of the Sherlock Holmes stories have been adapted time and time again. I feel like you're honestly nearly always going into the originals knowing the outcome of the story. And so I think it speaks a lot for Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and just in general, the love that people have for Sherlock Holmes as a character, that this is one that still rates so highly for people, that it still feels fresh and new when people revisit the original stories. I also am just in general not really a short story or novella type of person. I have definitely gotten more into that in recent years, especially as regards classics. I have really enjoyed classic short stories and novellas over the past couple of years, so maybe I should definitely revisit Sherlock Holmes, but I have not liked Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's writing in anything. I have tried him in various different genres. I think he actually really enjoyed writing historical fiction, and he really thought that was what was going to be the most popular of his books, and sadly, it wasn't. I think of all of the books mentioned here, Sherlock Holmes is probably the most recognizable name or title because so many adaptations exist out there. So I do think there's something to be said for it. The originals must be very, very special to continue to capture people's attention the way that they do. Then we have Wuthering Heights, which I am going to say is one of my favorite Victorian novels, possibly my second favorite. But this is the one I understand 100%. You either love or hate this one. And for me, I love this one, and I think it is genuinely because of the prose. I think it is just so beautifully written, and I really think it's quotable. I also think the romance here, the so-called romance, is kind of, in a way, romantic. This is definitely a toxic relationship, and I feel like people who are into what you might call dark romance today are probably primed to really get into Wuthering Heights. The issue that people have with Wuthering Heights is that it is often talked about in the modern day straight up as a romance book, and that is not necessarily what it was ever intended to be, and I also don't think Emily Bronte would have wanted you to interpret it that way. I think this is a book just truly composed of unlikable characters. And if you are someone who has to like somebody in the plot, you have to have a character that you want to root for, Wuthering Heights is really going to be hard for you. But if you're someone who's just kind of along for the ride, for me, Wuthering Heights is just a glimpse into a world that is so unlike our own that I really was just kind of hypnotized by it. And I often say this for Wuthering Heights. I have a really long review of this when I reread it a couple of years ago, but I think really the reason that I have taken to Wuthering Heights the way that I have is that I read it for the first time when I was a teenager, when I was around the same age as the characters. And there is something about this book that is angsty and emo on a level that I think only teenagers can truly relate to, teenagers in maybe early 20s. And I think when you revisit it as an adult, or if you read it for the first time as an adult, you're maybe not tapping into it the same way. And I feel like when I reread it, I loved it because I could read it for teen Jenny. And there are so many books like that. There are so many books that I read that I am reading exclusively for a younger version of myself. And Wuthering Heights, I think, is kind of like that. Wuthering Heights was just a lightning strike moment to me. And I think if I'm being objective, this is the best Victorian novel I've ever read. I know that people hate it, and I know that you can complain about the format of it, specifically the way that it's written and in the characterization. But to me, I don't really think there's a flaw here because it can be read on so many different levels. I 100% agree with this. A book I fully expected more people to talk about, and I'm actually shocked that it was only really a few, was Middlemarch. Before coming on to BookTube, I'll fully tell you how kind of out of the loop I was with Victorian novels, and maybe just in general with classics. When I was in university, when I was studying things, I never got this modern. So I never really knew what was most famous in terms of Victorian novels before learning about Victober. I was completely new to Middlemarch in my first Victober, but I knew people talked about it as one of the greats, as one of the books that you really needed to cross off your bookish bucket list. And I did it in my first Victober. So this is actually one of the first Victorian novels that I ever read. I think people can be shocked by that, but I'll be honest with you, I didn't think this book was that dense. I didn't think it was that hard to read. And I am someone who has fully struggled with George Eliot elsewhere. And so I would definitely tell you if this one took some work. And I was surprised, honestly, at how approachable a book of this length was, This has never been my favorite though. There's something about Middlemarch that's a little bit too quiet for me. I'm definitely due for a reread of this. I would really like to go back and reread everything that I read in my first Victober, just because I was so entirely new to this time period and to what was being published, kind of the trends of the Victorian era. I really didn't know how to contextualize a lot of the books that I read during my first Victober. So I would really like to come back to Middlemarch, honestly, because I really do think I probably was missing out on a lot of what made it special. But I'll tell you, for me personally, George Eliot has never felt like the Victorian author for me. And so I've often wondered if Middlemarch was a bit of a fluke, that I really enjoyed it. So I would definitely like to revisit this. But since this is one that I've often heard talked about as just kind of a bucket list book, this is one that a lot of people really want to read at least once in their life. I'm not shocked that it reaches a level of favorite for a lot of people. For some people, this really is not just their best classic or their best Victorian novel. This to them is the greatest novel ever written. And that is something I would like to understand. I always get excited when I hear hype like that, and I really want to understand it. And Middlemarch to me was fine. It was okay. It was good even. But I never got that out of it. I never thought, oh wow, this is going to be one of my new favorites of all time. But I'm really happy that there are people who it works for, because I do think this one has a lot going in it. There are a lot of different characters, and I think who you connect to on a character level is kind of going to indicate how much you enjoy this book. We then have North and South by Elizabeth Gaskell. Of course, Queen, we love her. North and South is a really interesting one, and it's interesting for me personally to talk about it on the heels of Middlemarch, because again, I would say North and South is a book I had completely no knowledge of prior to getting onto BookTube. And I'm really shocked by that. I think we often study things like Weaing Heights or Jane Eyre here in the States, when I kind of think North and South could take their place very easily. And I think there's probably more to get out of it from a student perspective than some of these other Victorian novels, because this really did discuss class in such an interesting way and talk about romance. Like right off the bat, this man was down bad for her. And that was everything to me. North and South is one of my favorites too. It's kind of been edged out though, frankly, by other books of hers. And Mary Barton specifically is the one that edged out North and South for me. Mary Barton, I think, kind of deals with very similar topics, but I actually thought that it approached them in a different way, and in a way that I thought was a little bit more interesting than North and South. North and South is very much a romance with these political and kind of class discussions underlying it. To me, Mary Barton was a social novel, a political novel, and then there was romance kind of towards the bottom of the list. That was not what you were really reading Mary Barton for. And so it kind of depends on what you're interested in, I think, which one you prefer. But a lot of people love North and South, and a lot of people compare North and South to Pride and Prejudice specifically. I understand why. To me, this is 10 times what Pride and Prejudice is. And I think this really works for me as a romance novel because there is something else going on. I think a lot of the time, romances of the Regency period and even romances of the modern day, they are specifically about two people getting together. There's not necessarily a lot of other plot going on. And that's a struggle for me as a reader. That's something that I really appreciate as a reader, is having something else going on and something else to think about or talk about that can be an obstacle for the characters. A lot of times you're reading a romance book and you're thinking, what really is the big deal here? Just get together. There is nothing holding you back. In North and South, there are a lot of legitimate issues holding them back from being together. And what is interesting is how willing they are to work on those major issues together to make their relationship feasible. This is just a really interesting novel that, in my opinion, has quite a lot to say, especially from a social aspect, which I think is really interesting and is part of why I come to the Victorian period at all, is that I'm really interested in kind of learning something. I read classics a lot of the time, not just to read a book that I'm enjoying, but I'm often reading them for historical context. And I think if you're someone who enjoys that also, North and South just packs a big punch. It really is doing a lot in a very little amount of time. And so again, if you're someone who doesn't normally read classics or if you're intimidated by them, I think North and South is another great place to start because it's actually not that long. And I just love the way Elizabeth Gaskell writes. The plot and the romance here are also so great. They really keep you going. So if you're looking for a place to start, I kind of think North and South would be a great one. We did have a couple of people mention my favorite Victorian novel. That's The Woman in White by Wilkie Collins. I hope you were all sitting down. I know you're stunned. I know you did not see that coming. It's so funny because I have read books of Wilkie Collins' since that I would say are probably objectively better written or even better plotted. But there is just something about this one. I love this book with my whole heart, so I completely agree with this. I am on the side of everyone who said The Woman in White because, oh my gosh, it's incredible. I have said this time and again, I know a lot of the reason that I just truly loved The Woman in White is that I had a great reading experience of it. This is another book that I read in my first Victober, and we had a hurricane come through and it knocked out power for days. And so I read this book by candlelight, by flashlight, while it was storming outside. There just was genuinely no better atmosphere to read this book in. There's also a gothic quality to The Woman in White that I think is really fun. The atmosphere is great, but really you're reading this for the characters. Yes, there's a mystery. Yes, there's a really interesting plot and you're trying to figure out what's going on, but truly the characters here are out of this world. I still have a crush on Walter, the main character. I have such a big crush on him. It will never go away. I compare all other Victorian men to him, and they all fall short. Marion, one of the main female characters here, a queen. Even the villains, to me, are such well-rounded characters that you're really interested to see what they're going to do next. I just think this is masterfully written. Wilkie Collins has some ups and downs in his career. He's my favorite Victorian author, and I have read more books from him than I have from any other Victorian author, so I feel like I can say this. This is not just my favorite, but it is one of his best. I think he has 4 really big ones, and I would say, probably objectively, The Moonstone is probably the better structured book. No Name is also, I think, better written. Armadale in general has the best plot, but there's something about The Woman in White that marries all of the great elements of his other 3 big works that it's just really fantastic. It really does make this one stand out above the rest of his novels. So I completely agree with this. The Woman in White is my favorite Victorian novel. Last but not least is a book that I have not yet read, but I'm kind of not shocked to see here, and that is New Grub Street. I have been intrigued by this in the past, but so many people have said that the writing is really intense and really intimidating that it's kind of put me off of reading it. But in general, I'm kind of intimidated by George Gissing. There's a reason that I have yet to try any of his books. So if you have read this one, give me a good pitch for this down below. I think this is about the publishing industry, which I do think is probably objectively a really interesting setting for a Victorian novel. Since there was such a massive rise in terms of literacy in the Victorian period, I think it would be really interesting to read something set in the publishing industry of that time, especially because the novel was taking off. George Gissing, if I'm not mistaken, was also writing later in the 19th century than a lot of the other Victorian authors. And I've noticed over the past few years that I actually really like novels that were written towards the end of the 19th century. And sometimes I think I prefer them if they were written in that back half. So that kind of encourages me. Of all of the favorite Victorian novels that y'all mentioned, to me, this one has the least name recognition. This is the least well known. And I think that's really interesting. So I definitely want to push this one up my TBR. But in general, the group of the favorite Victorian novels was a much smaller grouping than your worst Victorian novels, and I think that was kind of interesting. Some of these I definitely expected to see here, and some it was kind of a pleasant surprise. But I would love to know down below what your favorite Victorian novel is. That's going to be all from me today. I hope you're all having a great week. Happy reading. Happy Victober. Goodbye.